Twins see a millionaire fighting a venomous snake. Then they do this. Let me know what you thought of this story by giving it a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you like my story and get to know you better. So subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The hot metal of the fishing rod seared against Arthur Blackwood's palm as he tried to fend off the serpent that had emerged from his rose bushes. The 58-year-old man cried out in pain and desperation, stumbling backward as the rattlesnake coiled menacingly, ready to strike again. It was an especially sweltering March afternoon in Telluride, and the sun beat down relentlessly on the garden of the historic estate that had belonged to the Blackwood family for 3 generations. Arthur had always been known in the historic town as a man of few smiles and much suspicion. Since taking over the family jewelry business after his father's death, he had built a reputation for coldness in business that perfectly mirrored the ice that had formed in his heart after the sudden disappearance of Eleanor, his wife, 3 years earlier. In that moment, however, all his arrogance and control crumbled before the deadly threat that swayed its triangular head just a few feet away. It was then that 2 small figures appeared, running from the back of the garden. They were twin girls, appearing to be about 4 years old, with tangled brown hair and dresses that had once been white, but now bore the marks of life on the streets. Their bare feet slapped against the dirt as they ran toward the serpent, holding dry branches they had picked up along the way. Arthur screamed for them to get out of there, terrified by the possibility of seeing 2 children attacked before his eyes. But the girls did not retreat. With a courage that absurdly contrasted with their age and apparent fragility, they began to beat the rattlesnake with the sticks, making coordinated movements as if they had rehearsed this dangerous dance for years. The snake, confused by the multiple attacks coming from different directions, hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that this territory was not worth the fight. It slid quickly toward the denser bushes, disappearing among the foliage, while leaving behind only the hissing sound that still echoed in Arthur's ears. The twins turned to him, and it was then that Arthur noticed something disturbing in their eyes. There were no tears, no fear, not even the natural relief that should follow such a dangerous situation. There was only a deep emptiness, a resignation that should not exist in children so young. They communicated through quick, silent gestures, a language only they seemed to understand. Arthur asked, his voice still trembling from the adrenaline and the pain in his burned palm, if they were all right. The girls just watched him in silence, as if evaluating whether he posed a greater threat than the snake they had just chased away. The taller of the 2, who had a small scar on her chin, made a gesture to her sister, and both began to walk away. Arthur felt a strange impulse to call them back, but his suspicious nature spoke louder. These children clearly lived on the streets, and he had learned long ago that getting involved with other people's problems only brought complications. He called for them to wait, reaching for the wallet in his back pocket. He took out a few bills and held them out to the girls, offering them for what they had done. The twins glanced at each other, but did not approach. The smaller one shook her head no, and both continued walking toward the wrought iron gate that separated the property from the cobblestone street. Arthur stood there, watching them leave, his palm throbbing and 1,000 questions forming in his mind. How had 2 such small children appeared on his property? Why didn't they speak? And most of all, why did the image of them driving away that snake awaken in him such a familiar and painful feeling? The afternoon wore on, but Arthur couldn't concentrate on anything else. He sat on the veranda of his mansion, watching the street's movement through the gate's bars. Telluride was a town where everyone knew each other for generations, where secrets were the local currency in the cafes, and where gossip traveled faster than the waters of the San Miguel River. But those 2 girls were a mystery he couldn't decipher. As the sun began to set behind the mountains surrounding the town, Painting the sky in orange hues that reflected in the historic windows, Arthur saw the twins again. They had appeared in the square across from his house, sitting under the ancient cottonwood tree. They watched his mansion with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something about those children that stirred layers of his personality he preferred to keep buried. Since Eleanor's disappearance, Arthur had built emotional walls as high as those surrounding his property. Work, business, and solitude had become his comfortable and safe routine, but the silent presence of those girls seemed to question all of it. As night fell, and the town's historic lights came on one by one, the twins finally stood up and walked slowly down the street. Arthur watched them until they disappeared around the bend, leading to the historic center. But he remained on his veranda for hours, unable to banish from his thoughts the image of the absurd courage they had shown. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Arthur dreamed of something other than Eleanor and the mysterious circumstances of her departure. He dreamed of 2 mute girls facing snakes with sticks, and he woke up with the strange certainty that his orderly and predictable life was about to be turned upside down. The next morning arrived with the tolling of the bells from St. Patrick's Parish, but Arthur had been awake for hours, watching from his bedroom window the square where he had seen the twins the night before. The coffee grew cold in his cup as he searched his memories, trying to understand why those 2 children stirred such a deep anguish in him. That's when he saw them again. They were walking down the cobblestone street with the same silent coordination as the day before, but this time they were carrying something in their hands. Arthur quickly descended the wooden stairs that creaked under his feet and positioned himself discreetly behind the living room curtains. The girls had stopped in front of his gate and placed something on the ground before moving back a few feet. Curiosity overcoming caution, Arthur opened the gate and found 2 small injured birds, carefully wrapped in clean pieces of cloth. One had a broken wing, the other was bleeding from a cut on its head. The twins watched him from a distance, their expressions expectant but resigned. As if they were used to rejection, Arthur asked, his voice rougher than he intended, what they wanted him to do with this. The girls communicated through quick gestures, and the taller one pointed to the birds, then to him, making movements that clearly meant care and healing. Arthur looked at the small, wounded creatures and felt something move in his hardened chest. They were just birds, but there was something in the way the girls had brought them to him that touched him unexpectedly. Perhaps it was the delicacy with which they had been wrapped, or the silent hope in the twins' eyes. He muttered that he knew nothing about caring for birds, but his hands were already carefully picking up the small bundles. The girls smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he had seen on their faces, and walked away again, disappearing among the narrow streets of the historic center. Arthur spent the morning improvising care for the injured birds. He used vague first aid knowledge to clean the wounds and create small splints for the broken wing. It was meticulous work that required patience, a quality he had long lost in his daily business dealings. In the afternoon, as he headed to the family jewelry store located on Telluride's main street, Arthur noticed something disturbing. The twins were sitting on the church steps, holding out small hands to passers-by, but it wasn't a common plea for charity. They were offering small objects, polished stones, wildflowers, drawings made with charcoal on pieces of cardboard. Mrs. Agnes Miller, the church's 62-year-old caretaker, murmured that they were poor things as she approached him, noticing his fixed gaze on the girls. The woman had completely white hair tied in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen many human tragedies over the years. Arthur, trying to sound casual, asked Mrs. Miller how long those children had been in town. The caretaker adjusted her shawl and sighed deeply. She explained that they had appeared during the Miners' Day festival last year. A very sick woman had brought them, poor thing, barely able to stand. She had left the girls in the square and said she would return, but was never seen again. He asked if anyone knew who they were or where they came from. Agnes replied that they had tried to find out, of course, but the girls didn't speak. They couldn't get a word out of them. They slept in the abandoned shed behind the church, living off what they could get on the streets. Father John had tried to place them with a family, but they always ran away and came back here. Arthur felt a strange weight in his stomach and asked what the woman who brought them was like. She was young, very thin, with long, dark hair, Agnes said. There was a heartbreaking sadness in her eyes. But what struck her most was a bracelet she wore, silver with small blue stones. She had never seen anything like it. Mrs. Miller paused, studying Arthur's face, and asked why he was so interested. He didn't answer immediately. The description of the bracelet had awakened a painful memory. Eleanor had owned a bracelet exactly like that. It was a unique piece he had specially commissioned for her at their own jewelry store. But that was impossible. Eleanor had left 3 years ago, and these children had only appeared last year. He lied, saying it was just curiosity, but Mrs. Miller had known him long enough to sense there was something more behind his questions. The rest of the day passed in a fog of confusion. At the jewelry store, Arthur tried to focus on business, but his mind kept returning to the twins and the description of the mysterious woman who had left them. Damien Vance, his 45-year-old partner, noticed his distraction during the meeting about supply contracts. Damien asked if everything was all right, his small, calculating eyes observing every reaction. He noted that Arthur seemed troubled today. Arthur replied that he was just tired, but he could feel his partner's penetrating gaze. Damien had always been ambitious, and in recent months, Arthur had noticed a series of questionable decisions being made in his name. Contracts he didn't remember authorizing, risky investments that made no sense. Damien suggested with false concern that maybe he should take a few days off, assuring him that he could handle everything there. That was exactly what Arthur feared. For the past 3 years, since Eleanor disappeared, he had allowed himself to be carried away by apathy, letting Damien assume more and more control over the family business. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt he needed to be alert. Upon returning home late in the afternoon, Arthur found a surprise. The 2 injured birds were visibly better. The one with the broken wing could weakly flap its wings, and the other had stopped bleeding. But what really surprised him was finding the twins sitting in his garden, watching the birds through the window. They didn't run away when he approached. On the contrary, the smaller of the 2 made gestures indicating the birds, and then touched her own chest, as if thanking him. Arthur felt a strange emotion rising in his throat. He said softly that they had saved his life yesterday, and today they brought these birds for him to care for, and he asked why. The girls looked at each other and began their silent gestural communication. Then the taller one approached him and carefully touched his injured hand where the fishing rod had burned the skin. The gesture was so gentle, so full of understanding, that Arthur had to fight back tears he hadn't shed in years. In that moment, looking at those 2 little children who had appeared in his life so unexpectedly, Arthur made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't simply ignore them or push them back onto the streets. There was something in them that awakened a responsibility he thought he had buried, along with all his other emotions. He asked if they were hungry, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt that perhaps his empty house could serve for something more than just holding his sorrows and loneliness. The twins accepted the invitation to dinner with a hesitation that revealed years of mistrust cultivated on the streets of Telluride. Arthur led them through the mansion, noticing how they observed every detail with large, attentive eyes, their small hands intertwined as if one was the other's anchor in a world full of uncertainties. The dining table, which for 3 years had served only 1 person, now accommodated 3 chairs. Arthur served vegetable soup and fresh bread, watching with fascination as the girls communicated through subtle touches and meaningful glances. It was as if they shared a secret language developed to survive in a world that didn't understand them. He asked what their names were, although he knew he wouldn't get a verbal answer. The taller one pointed to herself and made a delicate gesture with her hands that resembled a flower opening. The smaller one touched her own eyes and then made a circular motion in the air. Arthur frowned, trying to decipher the signs. It was then that he remembered something Eleanor had told him years ago about sign language. She had briefly volunteered at an institution for children with special needs before they were married. With hesitant movements, Arthur tried to repeat the girl's gestures. The result was a shy smile from the younger one, who repeated the movement more slowly. Flower. Lily. The taller one was Lily, and the little one, Eyes Vision. Rose. Rose touched her chest and nodded enthusiastically, confirming he had understood. During the meal, Arthur observed disturbing details he hadn't noticed before. The girls' clothes, though tattered, were of good quality. The fabric and finishes suggested they had once belonged to a well-off family. Even more unsettling were the small marks on their wrists, not recent injuries but old scars that spoke of a painful history. He asked if they had ever lived in a house like this. Lily and Rose exchanged a meaningful look before Lily made an affirmative gesture. Then her expression darkened and she made movements that clearly indicated loss, separation, pain. After dinner, Arthur took them to see the injured birds. The girls were delighted to see that the small creatures were recovering. Rose made elaborate gestures that seemed to tell a story, and Arthur understood that they had found the injured birds near the town cemetery. He asked if they always took care of injured animals. The answer came through a series of gestures that revealed a routine. They found hurt creatures, tried to help with the few resources they had, but often couldn't save them. There was a deep sadness in the way they told this, as if they carried the weight of all the lives they couldn't preserve. When it was time to say goodbye, Arthur felt a strange reluctance to let them go. He asked where they would sleep that night. Lily pointed toward the church, but there was a shame in her movements that broke Arthur's heart. They knew it wasn't a proper place for children, but they had no alternative. He impulsively told them they could stay, then backed off when he saw fear in their eyes. He reassured them they didn't need to worry, that there were empty rooms there, real beds, a hot bath. The twins looked at each other in a silent conversation that lasted several minutes. Finally, Rose made a gesture that clearly meant, "Thank you," but shook her head no. They wouldn't stay. They still didn't trust him enough. Arthur watched them leave for the third time, but this time something was different. A connection had been established, still fragile, but real. When they disappeared into the darkness of the night, he remained on the veranda for hours, lost in thought. The next morning, Arthur woke with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He went straight to the county clerk's office, where he worked until he found the records of all orphan children registered in the town in the last year. There was no mention of mute twins. His next stop was the recorder's office, where he spoke with Mr. Benedict Carter, the clerk who had known all the births, deaths, and records in the region for over 40 years. He told Mr. Carter he needed information about 2 twin girls who appeared in town last year. The elderly man adjusted his glasses and thought carefully. He remembered them, the mute girls, a sad case. Their mother was very sick when she arrived, barely able to walk. Arthur asked if he had seen her personally. The clerk had, a beautiful woman despite her illness, with dark hair and green eyes. She wore a very pretty silver bracelet. But what caught his attention most was that she seemed to know the town. She didn't ask for directions, went straight to the central square, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Arthur's heart raced. He asked if she said anything, mentioned any name. She was too weak to say much, the clerk recalled, but he heard her whisper something to the girls before she left, something like, "Find the Birdman." At the time, he thought it was a feverish delusion. The Birdman. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Eleanor had always called him that, teasing him about his habit of watching the birds in the garden. It was an intimate joke between them, something no one else would know. He asked Mr. Carter which direction the woman took when she left the square. "She went up the hill toward the cemetery," he said. "Some say she never left town, that she's buried up there. But those are just rumors." Arthur left the office with more questions than answers. If the mysterious woman really knew Eleanor well enough to know about the affectionate nickname, it meant there was a connection between his missing wife and the twins. But what could it be? In the afternoon, when he returned to the jewelry store, he found Damien in his office rummaging through papers on his desk. His partner was startled to see him. Damien exclaimed Arthur's name, saying he wasn't expecting him so soon, that he was just organizing some contracts. Arthur asked what contracts, noticing several important documents scattered on the desk, including some family deeds that should have been in the safe. Damien said it was nothing important, just reviewing the terms of the bank loan they took out last month. Arthur questioned what loan, as he didn't remember authorizing any. Damien hesitated, and Arthur saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. Damien insisted that he had authorized it, reminding him he was going through a tough time and that he had taken care of everything so as not to overwhelm him. It was a lie. Arthur was absolutely certain he had never authorized such a transaction, but before he could confront his partner, the door opened and Lily and Rose entered the jewelry store, their eyes sparkling at the sight of the showcases full of precious items. Damien's reaction was immediate and harsh. He demanded to know what those beggars were doing there and ordered them out, claiming they would scare away the customers. Arthur felt a fury he hadn't experienced in years, stating firmly that they were with him. Damien questioned his sanity, asking if he had completely lost his mind. The twins recoiled, clearly frightened by Damien's hostility, but then something extraordinary happened. Rose pointed to one of the showcases and made urgent gestures to Lily. The two approached a specific shelf and began gesturing excitedly. Arthur followed their gaze and felt the world collapse. There, in a small velvet box, was the silver bracelet with blue stones he had commissioned for Eleanor. The bracelet she was wearing when she disappeared. The bracelet that should have been with her, wherever she was. The silence that followed in the jewelry store was deafening. Arthur stared at Eleanor's bracelet in the showcase as if it were an apparition, while the twins continued to gesture urgently, pointing at the piece and then at themselves. Damien had turned visibly pale, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain a neutral expression. Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous, where that bracelet came from. He knew every detail of the piece. He had personally overseen its creation 3 years before, choosing each blue stone, each curve of the worked silver. Damien stammered that he didn't remember exactly, suggesting it must have been one of the pieces they bought from a private collector, noting how they received so many items. A lie. Arthur approached the showcase and removed the bracelet with trembling hands. Inside the silver, engraved in tiny letters that only he knew, were the initials E.B., Eleanor Blackwood. He stated that this bracelet was made here by him for his wife and demanded to know how it came into Damien's hands. Lily and Rose watched the growing tension between the two men with wide eyes. Rose made a discreet gesture to Lily, who nodded and approached Arthur. With careful movements, she touched the bracelet and then made complex gestures that seemed to tell a story. The girl pointed to herself and Rose, then gestured a woman carrying something, walking with difficulty. Next, she simulated handing over something precious and made movements that clearly indicated farewell and sadness. Finally, she pointed to the bracelet and made the universal gesture for giving, as if the mysterious woman had handed the piece to someone. Arthur whispered, the realization hitting him like a lightning bolt. That she was saying the woman who brought them to town wore this bracelet and that she gave it to someone before she left. Damien stepped back, his mask of falsehood finally falling. He accused Arthur of being delirious, of believing the disturbed, non-speaking children, but Arthur was no longer listening to his partner's excuses. His hands trembled as he held the bracelet, painful memories flooding his mind. Eleanor had disappeared on a rainy winter night, leaving only a vague note about needing to leave. He had spent 3 years believing she had abandoned him, building walls of bitterness around his heart. He asked, his voice filled with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, where she was, where Eleanor was. Damien cruelly asked how he would know, reminding him she had left, had abandoned him, just like everyone eventually does. But there was something in his tone that revealed too much knowledge about Eleanor's departure. Arthur studied his partner's face and saw guilt written in every line of his expression. He asserted that Damien knew something that he had always known. At that moment, Lily approached again and made a series of urgent gestures. She pointed to Damien, then made movements that clearly indicated hiding, lying, doing something in secret. Rose joined her sister, and together they told a story through gestures that made Arthur's blood run cold. They had seen Damien meet with a sick woman near the cemetery. The woman had given him the bracelet, along with other objects. There were tears, desperation, and then the woman had disappeared among the old tombstones. Arthur whispered, looking at the twins with a mixture of gratitude and terror, that they had seen her. They had seen Eleanor. Damien began to laugh, a bitter, desperate sound. He called Arthur pathetic for his delusion, for basing it on the gestures of 2 mute, disturbed children. But his laughter couldn't hide the panic in his eyes. Arthur watched his partner with new clarity, seeing for the first time the signs he had ignored for years. The decisions made without his authorization, the modified contracts, the bank loan he had never approved. Damien had taken advantage of his fragile emotional state to gradually take control of the family company. Arthur asked, his voice icy, how many years he had waited, how many years he had planned this. Damien claimed not to know what he was talking about. Arthur pressed on, stating that Damien knew Eleanor was sick, that she had left not out of lack of love, but because she was dying and didn't want him to suffer watching her decline. The twins watched the confrontation with wide eyes, their small hands intertwined. Rose made discreet gestures that confirmed Arthur's suspicions. They had witnessed secret meetings, whispered conversations, deliveries of documents. He continued, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together in his mind, accusing Damien of intercepting her letters to him, of keeping him in the dark about her condition so that he would remain bitter and distracted, making his gradual takeover of the business easier. Damien didn't answer, but his silence was confession enough. Arthur felt a fury he hadn't experienced in years, mixed with a renewed pain for the loss of Eleanor. She had left to protect him, but her protection had been used against him by the man he trusted most. He demanded to know where she was buried. Damien spat that even if he knew, he wouldn't tell him, that he didn't deserve to know, that he never deserved a woman like her. That's when Lily did something surprising. The girl approached a specific shelf in the jewelry store and pointed to a drawer that Arthur rarely opened. With urgent gestures, she indicated that there was something important there, something Damien had hidden. Arthur opened the drawer and found a small box he didn't recognize. Inside, it were letters. Letters in a familiar handwriting, letters that Eleanor had written to him, but that he had never received. His hands trembled as he read the first lines of the first letter. It was from his dear Eleanor, asking for forgiveness for not having the courage to tell him in person. The doctor said she didn't have much time. She chose to leave now while she could still remember his smile, rather than let him watch her waste away. The letter slipped from his trembling hands. Eleanor hadn't abandoned him. She had left out of love, trying to spare him the pain of watching her die, and Damien had stolen from him not only the truth, but also his wife's final words. Arthur's voice was low and dangerous as he demanded to know where his wife was. Damien backed toward the door, but it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and there was no longer any way to hide years of betrayal and manipulation. The twins watched everything in silence, as if they knew they were witnessing a moment that would change everything forever. The tension in the jewelry store was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps on the cobblestone sidewalk. Damien took advantage of the distraction to escape through the back door, leaving behind only the echo of his lies and a silent confession of guilt. Arthur held Eleanor's letters tightly, feeling the weight of 3 years of deception settle on his shoulders. Lily and Rose remained by his side, their small presences offering a strange comfort amidst the turmoil of emotions. Rose gently touched Arthur's arm and made gestures that clearly meant solidarity and understanding. It was as if these children, who had faced their own tragedies, instinctively recognized the pain of others. Arthur locked up the jewelry store early that day and took the twins back to his mansion. The walk through the historic streets of Telluride was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun painted the stone walls a melancholy gold that perfectly mirrored Arthur's state of mind. At home, he sat in the library and began to read all of Eleanor's letters one by one. The twins settled on the floor near him, drawing figures in the dust that had accumulated on the long, unread books. There was a strange peace in that domestic scene, as if the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. The letters revealed a story of love and sacrifice that broke Arthur's heart. Eleanor had discovered her serious illness a few months before she disappeared. Knowing the cancer was aggressive and that there was no effective treatment available in the region, she had chosen to leave silently, preferring that Arthur remember her healthy and vibrant. She had written in one of the most painful letters that she didn't want him to see her fade away, that she'd rather he keep the image of their last happy moments, when they still danced on the veranda to the sound of the rain. She was leaving to seek treatment in a distant city, but if things didn't go well, she wanted him to know that her last thought would be of his smile. Arthur had to stop reading, the tears blurring the carefully written words. Lily noticed his anguish and approached, offering him a drawing she had just made in the dust. It was a female figure with long hair, surrounded by small hearts. Even without words, the girl had understood that he was suffering from the loss of a loved one. Eleanor's last letter was the most revealing. In it, she mentioned having met a young woman in the hospital where she was being treated, a woman who was also very sick but had 2 small daughters. Eleanor had written that the woman reminded her of her younger self, strong, determined, but haunted by circumstances she couldn't control. She had promised her that if anything happened to her, she would try to ensure her daughters found a good family. Arthur's heart pounded. Eleanor had met the twins' mother. More than that, she had made a promise to a dying woman that she would take care of her daughters. But how had that promise reached him? Lily, as if sensing the importance of that moment, stood up and went to one of the library shelves. With precise gestures, she indicated a specific book, a volume of poetry that had been a favorite of Eleanor's. Arthur took the book from the shelf and found, between its pages, a small key he didn't recognize. He asked the twins what the key opened, but they seemed as confused as he was. It was then that Rose made gestures indicating the garden, specifically the area where he grew his roses. The children had observed more than he had imagined during their silent visits. Together, the 3 of them went to the garden. Arthur's roses were blooming magnificently, their vibrant colors contrasting with the melancholy that hung over the property. Rose walked directly to Eleanor's favorite white rosebush and pointed to its base, where the earth seemed to have been recently moved. Arthur felt his breath quicken. Carefully, he began to dig around the rose bush. A few inches below the surface, his hands found a small metal box. The key he had found in the book fit perfectly into the lock. Inside the box were documents that completely changed his understanding of the last 3 years. There were medical certificates confirming Eleanor's illness, correspondence with doctors in other cities, and even more surprisingly, a series of legal documents transferring part of her personal fortune to a woman named Isabella Morgan, the twins' mother. He whispered that she knew, the pieces finally fitting together. Eleanor knew their mother was dying and had left money to secure their future, but there was something else in the box that made his blood run cold. They were copies of documents from the jewelry store showing that Damien had intercepted all the money transfers intended for Isabella. His partner had stolen not only the truth about Eleanor, but also the resources that should have guaranteed a decent life for the twins. Lily and Rose watched Arthur with large, hopeful eyes, as if they finally understood that someone was unraveling the truth about their origins. Rose made gestures that clearly asked about their mother, about what had happened to her. Arthur looked at those 2 brave children who had saved his life, and who, without knowing it, were also saving his soul. Their mother had been a victim of the same betrayal as he, and now she was dead. He was sure of it from the clues he had gathered. But her daughters were still alive, still in need of protection and love. He said gently that she was a very brave woman, even though he knew they couldn't hear him, and that they were just like her. That night, for the first time since Eleanor had left, Arthur did not feel completely alone in his mansion. He prepared a proper dinner for the twins and convinced them to accept temporary rooms in his house. They were still nervous and scared, communicating mainly with each other, but there was a growing trust in their eyes. Before sleeping, Arthur wrote a long letter to the family lawyer, detailing all the evidence he had discovered against Damien. It would be a difficult legal battle, but now he had concrete proof of fraud and mismanagement. More importantly, he had a reason to fight. As he put Eleanor's letters in a safe place, he found a postscript in the last one that he had previously overlooked. If something happened to her, he should look for the children of the promise. They would bring him back to life, just as he had brought her to life when they met. The children of the promise, Lily and Rose. Eleanor had orchestrated everything, even in her final moments, so that he would find a renewed purpose in caring for her friend's orphaned daughters. Arthur looked out his bedroom window and saw one of the twins, Rose, sitting on the veranda, watching the stars. She seemed so small and vulnerable, yet she carried a strength he was only beginning to comprehend. These children had survived the loss of their mother, life on the streets, the abandonment of society. And now, through their silent courage, they had exposed a conspiracy that could have completely destroyed his life. For the first time in 3 years, Arthur fell asleep with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the next day would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. The dawn brought with it a sense of urgency that Arthur hadn't felt in years. He woke up early and found the twins already awake in the kitchen, trying to make breakfast with the few ingredients they could find. The sight of those 2 small children trying to be useful deeply touched his hardened heart. He gently told them to let him handle it, taking control of the kitchen. As he prepared scrambled eggs and toast, he watched how Lily and Rose communicated through subtle gestures about his every move, as if they were cataloging every detail of kindness to compare with past experiences. During breakfast, Arthur made a decision he knew was risky. He looked directly at the girls and told them he wanted them to accompany him today, that they were going to look for answers about what happened to their mother. Lily and Rose exchanged a look filled with emotion. Rose made hesitant gestures that clearly asked if he was sure, if it wouldn't be dangerous. There was fear in her movements, but also a desperate hope that had been suffocated for too long. Their first stop was the municipal cemetery, located in the oldest part of Telluride. The marble and stone tombstones told stories of families who had built the town during the mining boom. Arthur walked slowly among the graves, the twins on either side, their small eyes scanning each inscription. It was Lily who found it. The girl stopped abruptly before a simple grave with no elaborate headstone, just a small wooden cross with the name Isabella Morgan carved in uneven letters. There was no date of birth, only the previous year, confirming that she had died just a few months after leaving the girls in the central square. Rose knelt before the grave and began to make elaborate gestures, as if she were talking to her mother. Lily joined her, and together they created a kind of silent ritual that was both touching and devastating. Arthur felt tears burning his eyes as he watched those children finally get a chance to say a proper goodbye. He whispered that she was at peace now, not knowing if they could hear him, but needing to say the words, and that they were no longer alone. After an hour at the cemetery, they headed to Mercy General Hospital, the small hospital where Eleanor had mentioned meeting Isabella. The Mother Superior, a serious woman named Sister Cecilia, received them with initial caution that turned to compassion when Arthur explained the situation. The sister said she remembered Isabella well, such a young but brave woman. She had arrived already in a terminal state, but refused to be admitted because she needed to care for her daughters. They tried to convince her, but she said she had nowhere to leave the girls. Arthur asked if she mentioned knowing his wife, Eleanor. The sister confirmed they had become very close in the few days Eleanor was there. His wife was undergoing experimental treatment, and Isabella was in palliative care. They would spend hours talking about their children, Eleanor about the children she never had, Isabella about the twins she was about to leave orphaned. Lily and Rose watched the conversation with intense focus, clearly recognizing their mother's name being mentioned. Rose made gestures to Arthur that seemed to ask for more details. He asked if Isabella had left anything there, any personal belongings. She had, in fact. She had asked the sister to keep a small box, saying that if anyone came looking for the girls, she should hand it over. Sister Cecilia never thought it would take so long. She returned a few minutes later with a simple wooden box, carefully decorated with small hand-painted flowers. Inside were family photographs, some baby clothes that had clearly belonged to the twins, and a sealed letter addressed to whoever cares for my daughters. Arthur opened the letter with trembling hands. Isabella's handwriting was delicate but firm, revealing an educated woman who had fallen on hard times. If someone is reading this letter, it means my dear Lily and Rose have found a family. They are special children, not just because they are mute, a condition they developed after losing their father in an accident when they were only 2, but because they possess extraordinary intuition and courage. They were the daughters of a talented jeweler who died too young, leaving us without resources. I tried to maintain our dignity, but my illness defeated me. Eleanor Blackwood, a wonderful woman I met in the hospital, promised me she would find a way to ensure my daughter's future. If you are reading this, perhaps she kept her promise even after leaving this world. Lily and Rose are bilingual in gestures. They created their own language, but also understand conventional signs. They are intelligent, loyal, and have a special gift for caring for injured creatures. I only ask that you love them as I love them, and that you teach them that life can be beautiful again. Arthur had to stop reading, his voice choked with emotion. The twins had come closer and were looking at the photographs in the box, with silent tears streaming down their small faces. One photo showed a handsome young man holding 2 baby twins, clearly the father they had lost so early. Arthur asked Sister Cecilia what exactly happened to Isabella, how she died. The nun hesitated before answering. Officially, it was complications from the disease, but there were strange circumstances. The night before her death, a man came to visit her. There was a heated conversation in the hallway. The nun heard fragments, something about money, about documents she was supposed to sign. She refused, and the man left very angry. Arthur asked what kind of man he was. Well-dressed, middle-aged, he claimed to be a lawyer, but there was something in his eyes that didn't inspire confidence. Isabella was very agitated after his visit. She died during the night alone. Arthur felt a cold fury rising in his chest. Damien! It had to be Damien. He had tried to force Isabella, already on her deathbed, to sign documents renouncing the money Eleanor had left for the twins. When she refused, he simply waited for nature to take its course. Sister Cecilia added one more thing. Isabella had made her promise that if anything happened to her, she would ensure the girls went to the central square of Telluride on the first sunny day after her death. She said that there they would find the Birdman that Eleanor had mentioned. The Birdman. Again, that intimate reference that only Eleanor used. Even while dying, she had found a way to guide the twins to him. The plan had been complex and risky, but it had worked. When they left the hospital, Arthur knelt before the twins on the historic steps. He wanted them to understand one thing, he said, speaking slowly and using some simple gestures he had learned from watching them. He told them they were not orphans, not anymore, that they had a family now, if they wanted it. Lily and Rose looked at each other in a silent conversation that lasted several minutes. Finally, Rose approached him and, for the first time since they had met, hugged him. It was a hesitant hug at first, but it soon became desperate, as if she were clinging to the first real security she had known in years. Lily joined the hug, and for a few moments, the three of them remained there, on the hospital steps, creating an unlikely but genuine family amidst the century-old stones of Telluride. The way back home was different. The twins walked closer to him, no longer as suspicious strangers, but as children who had finally found a safe harbor. But Arthur knew the battle was far from over. Damien was still out there, probably planning his next move to maintain control of the company and silence any threat to his ambitions. The tranquility of their first days together was brutally interrupted a week later when Arthur arrived home to find the main door of the mansion ajar. His heart immediately raced. He was absolutely sure he had locked everything before leaving to resolve banking issues related to the fraudulent documents he had discovered. He called out for Lily and Rose, running through the house. The silence he received in response was more frightening than any scream. The living room was ransacked, furniture overturned, drawers open, and documents scattered on the floor. Someone had been looking for something specific and looking with desperation. Arthur took the stairs two at a time, checking each room. His heart nearly stopped when he found the twins' room empty, the small beds he had prepared with such care unmade and abandoned. At the window, curtains billowed in the wind, and there were signs that someone had left through there in a great hurry. It was then that he heard a faint noise coming from the attic, the sound of cautious movement, as if someone were trying to hide. Arthur grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick and slowly climbed the narrow staircase leading to the top floor of the mansion. In the dusty attic, behind old Blackwood family chests, he found the twins huddled together, trembling with fear. Rose clutched a crumpled piece of paper, while Lily kept her eyes fixed on the stairs, as if expecting a threat to emerge at any moment. He knelt beside them and asked if they were okay, what had happened. Lily made urgent, frightened gestures, describing men who had broken into the house, searched for something specific, and made threats. Rose showed him the paper she was holding. It was a note left by the intruders. "Return what is not yours, or the consequences will be irreversible. You have 48 hours. Arthur felt a cold fury rise in his chest. Damien had crossed an unacceptable line by threatening innocent children, but there was something more disturbing about the situation. How did his ex-partner know exactly what to look for? What else had he hidden all these years? He gently told the twins to come, that they would leave the house for a few days, as it wasn't safe to stay there. Arthur took Lily and Rose to the only person in Telluride he still completely trusted, Dr. Florence Desmond, the 71-year-old retired doctor who had looked after his family for decades. The old doctor lived in a modest but cozy house in the historic center, surrounded by a medicinal garden he cultivated with obsessive dedication. Dr. Desmond exclaimed Arthur's name in surprise upon opening the door and asked who the little ladies were. Arthur explained that he needed his help, that they were Lily and Rose, and that it was a long, complicated story, but they were in danger. The retired doctor invited them in, and his experienced eyes immediately noticed the twins' agitated state. He welcomed the girls and said they would prepare a calming tea while their father, guardian, told them what was happening. While Dr. Desmond prepared chamomile tea with honey, Arthur recounted the entire story, from the rattlesnake rescue to the discovery of Damien's conspiracy. The doctor listened attentively, asking occasional questions and observing the twins' reactions to each revelation. Dr. Desmond said slowly, studying Lily and Rose with professional attention, that there was something familiar about them, very familiar. When Arthur asked how so, the doctor explained that 4 years ago, on a rainy winter pre-dawn, a young woman had knocked on his door. She was in labor, very sick and desperate. He helped deliver twins, 2 beautiful, healthy girls. The mother refused to tell him her name, but he remembered her face perfectly. Arthur's heart sped up. He asked if the doctor was sure they were these girls. Absolutely, he replied. He remembered specific details. Lily was born with a small birthmark on her left shoulder. Rose had a slightly crooked toe. Nothing serious, just a quirk. Arthur looked at the twins, who were watching the conversation with growing interest. The doctor added that the woman had a peculiar scar on her left wrist, a crescent-shaped mark. She said she'd been injured trying to protect her daughters from some danger. Rose suddenly stood up and ran to Dr. Desmond. With urgent gestures, she pointed to her own wrist and made the shape of a moon with her hands. The doctor nodded gravely. He said that she remembered, that Rose remembered her mother's scar. Arthur carefully asked the doctor which direction the woman took when she left his house after the birth. That part was strange, he replied. She didn't leave immediately. She hid in a discreet boarding house for a few weeks. Recovering, he would visit her secretly to care for her and the babies. But one night, she simply disappeared. She left only a note saying that dangerous men were looking for her. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in Arthur's mind. He questioned if the dangerous men were Damien. The doctor thought it was possible. He always found it strange how Damien appeared in town around the same time. Damien wasn't from Telluride. He came from outside, quickly established himself in local business, always with money whose origin no one questioned much. That night, staying at Dr. Desmond's house, Arthur finally understood the scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. Damien wasn't just a greedy partner. He was someone who had been pursuing Isabella Morgan since before the twins' birth, probably for her husband's money or property. When Isabella fled to Telluride, pregnant and desperate, Damien followed her. For years, he waited patiently, building a position of power in the town, getting close to the Blackwood family business. When Eleanor fell ill and learned of Isabella's situation, she tried to help, but Damien intercepted everything. Arthur muttered that he had orchestrated the deaths of 2 innocent women and almost destroyed his life in the process. The doctor asked what he intended to do now. He would protect these children, Arthur declared, and he would make sure Damien paid for everything he did. The doctor warned him to be careful, that men like Damien are dangerous when cornered, and that he was clearly still after something specific. It was true. The invasion of his house had been too systematic to be mere intimidation. Damien was looking for something specific, but what? Arthur had given all the compromising documents to his lawyer, so what else could there be? It was then that he remembered something Eleanor had mentioned in one of her letters, a cryptic reference to the gift I left for you to find when you were ready to love again. He had assumed she meant the letters themselves. But what if there was something more? In the dead of night, while Dr. Desmond and the twins slept, Arthur silently left the house and returned to his mansion. If Damien was still looking for something, it meant he hadn't found it yet. And if Eleanor had hidden something important, he needed to find it before it was too late. The mansion was silent and dark, but Arthur knew every corner of the property. Using only a small flashlight, he began to search in places where Eleanor might have hidden something special. Places that had meaning for them as a couple, memories that only he would know. It was in their bedroom, behind the painting of the first bird they had saved together years ago, that he found a small, secret compartment. Inside, it was a document that completely changed his understanding of the entire situation. The next 3 days passed in a deceptive calm that Arthur knew wouldn't last. The twins adapted to the mansion's routine with an ease that revealed their survival skills, but also a deep craving for stability. For the first time in months, they slept in soft beds, took hot baths, and ate regular meals. Arthur discovered surprising aspects about Lily and Rose during this closer cohabitation. Despite being mute, they were extremely intelligent and observant. Lily had a talent for drawing, creating detailed images of the birds that visited the garden. Rose demonstrated impressive mathematical ability, arranging objects in complex patterns that revealed a sharp, analytical mind. On Thursday morning, however, the tranquility was brutally shattered. Arthur woke to the sound of raised voices coming from the garden. Looking out the window, he saw 2 men in suits examining his property, measuring distances and taking notes. One of them held official documents. He asked if he could help them, quickly descending to confront the intruders. The taller of the two, a man of about 40 with thick glasses, asked if he was Mr. Arthur Blackwood. He introduced himself as Oscar Hayes, a court officer, and stated he had an eviction order for the property, enforceable in 72 hours. The words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. Eviction? What were they talking about? This house had belonged to his family for 3 generations. According to the documents, Oscar explained, the property was given as collateral for a $2 million bank loan taken out 6 months ago. The payment was 90 days overdue, constituting serious default. Arthur insisted it was impossible, that he had never authorized such a loan. Oscar handed him a folder full of papers. He pointed out that Arthur's signature was on all the documents, duly notarized. Arthur leafed through the papers with trembling hands. The signatures were perfect imitations of his, but he was absolutely certain he had never seen those documents before. Damien had forged his signature to mortgage the ancestral family mansion, probably as revenge for the discovery of his schemes. Lily and Rose appeared on the veranda, watching the confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. They had just found a home and now risked losing it again. The look of terror on their small faces awakened a protective fury in Arthur that he didn't know he possessed. He said, trying to keep his voice controlled, that there was a mistake, that he contested the validity of these documents and would prove they were fraudulent. Oscar replied with professional indifference that he had the right to contest it legally, but the eviction order remained valid until a court decision to the contrary. 72 hours, Mr. Blackwood. After the men left, Arthur sat heavily on the veranda steps. The twins approached him, Rose gently touching his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. It was ironic. Children who had lost everything were now trying to console him for the possible loss of his home. He said, more to himself than to them, that he wouldn't let this happen, that he wouldn't let him destroy more lives. His first step was to seek out Dr. Florence Desmond, the 71-year-old retired doctor who had mentioned knowing the twins' mother. If there was anyone in Telluride who could provide testimony about Damien's manipulations, it would be him. Dr. Desmond received them in his modest, historic house, filled with old medical books and photographs from decades of community service. His kind eyes lit up when he saw the twins. He said with emotion that these were Isabella's girls, how they had grown, that he remembered the birth as if it were yesterday. Arthur told the doctor he needed his help, that Damien Vance was trying to steal his company and his house, and he believed he was also responsible for Isabella's premature death. The doctor's face darkened. He said he had always been suspicious of that man. On the night Isabella died, he showed up at the hospital demanding to speak with her. He was agitated, aggressive. A nurse told him she heard an argument in her room. Arthur asked what exactly he wanted. Documents, the doctor replied. She had received some kind of inheritance or donation, and he wanted her to renounce her rights. When she refused, he threatened her, said her daughters would never see a cent if she didn't cooperate. Lily and Rose watched the conversation intently, clearly recognizing references to their mother. Rose made elaborate gestures to Dr. Desmond, who smiled in recognition. He translated that she was asking about her mother's health. He asked Arthur to tell her that Isabella fought bravely, but was very sick, that there was nothing anyone could have done. Arthur repeated the information using simple gestures he had learned and saw silent tears stream down Rose's face. Lily hugged her, offering the comfort only a twin sister could provide. Arthur asked Dr. Desmond if he would testify about Damien's behavior that night. Of course, he said, but he would need more than the testimony of a retired doctor to face someone like him. That afternoon, Arthur made a desperate decision. He returned to the jewelry store, knowing Damien would likely be there, organizing the final details of his complete takeover of the business. He took the twins with him, not because he wanted to involve them in the confrontation, but because he couldn't leave them alone with court officers snooping around his property. He found Damien in the main office, signing papers with a triumphant air. His partner smiled when he saw them enter. He greeted Arthur and his little protégés, mentioning he'd heard they would have to find a new address soon. Arthur directly accused him of forging his signature, of mortgaging his house with fraudulent documents. Damien arrogantly told him to prove it, that his signature was notarized. He claimed Arthur was going through a difficult time, drinking too much, making bad decisions. So it was natural he didn't remember all the contracts he signed. It was a well-constructed lie, taking advantage of the fragile emotional state Arthur had shown after Eleanor's disappearance. Any court might believe that a man distraught over the loss of his wife had made reckless financial choices. Arthur then questioned him about Eleanor's letters, asking how he explained hiding his personal correspondence. Damien feigned ignorance, claiming not to know what he was talking about. He had prepared for everything. He had probably removed all compromising evidence from the jewelry store, keeping only what benefited him. It was then that Lily did something surprising. The girl approached a specific bookshelf and began making urgent gestures to Arthur. She pointed to a stack of accounting ledgers that seemed ordinary, but her movements indicated something important was there. Arthur followed Lily's directions and discovered, hidden between the pages of an old register, documents that Damien had forgotten to destroy. They were original contracts showing the differences between the forged versions and the real terms that had been agreed upon years before. Damien muttered, visibly shaken, asking how she knew that. Arthur replied that they observe everything, that he had underestimated the intelligence of 2 children who had survived for months on the streets. Rose joined her sister, and together they led Arthur to other hiding spots they had noticed during their previous visits to the jewelry store. It was as if they had mentally mapped all the locations where important documents were stored, creating a silent inventory of evidence. Damien watched the search with growing desperation, realizing that his carefully planned conspiracy was being dismantled by two 4-year-old children who couldn't speak but saw and remembered everything. He finally said, his mask of civility falling away completely, that it wouldn't work. Even if they found some irregularities, he had controlled the company for a long time. He had allies, influence, and they had nothing. It was partly true. Damien had spent years cultivating relationships and positions of power, but he had made a fundamental mistake. He had underestimated the strength that an unlikely family, united by the need to protect each other, could develop when faced with adversity. The document Arthur found in the secret compartment was a will. Not the official will he knew, but a second document. Handwritten by Eleanor herself, dated just 2 weeks before she left. His hands trembled as he read the first lines in the dim flashlight beam. "My beloved Arthur, if you are reading this, it means you have finally found the courage to seek the whole truth. This is my true will, written in full conscience and without the interference of lawyers or third parties who might distort my intentions." The document revealed that Eleanor had discovered not only her own illness, but also Damien's criminal activities long before she left. She had secretly hired a private investigator who documented years of fraud, blackmail, and manipulation. Even more shockingly, Damien had been responsible for the death of Isabella Morgan's husband, not an accident as everyone believed, but a carefully planned murder to gain access to the precious stone mines the young jeweler had inherited. "Damien Vance is not who he claims to be," the will continued. "His real name is Damien Slater, and he fled from Aspen after being accused of fraud in mining deals. He came to Telluride specifically to find Isabella and her daughters, not out of love or obsession, but because they are the sole legitimate heirs to one of the richest emerald deposits in the region." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. The twins weren't just needy orphans. They were heirs to a fortune that Damien had spent years trying to steal. His plan was to eliminate them, or force an irregular adoption that would give him legal control over their inheritance. "That's why he got close to you, my love," Eleanor had written. "Your respectable reputation and your position in Telluride society were perfect for legitimizing any fraudulent document. He planned to use our personal tragedy, our inability to have children, to justify an adoption of the twins that would actually be a way to steal everything that belongs to them." The will included copies of all the documents the investigator had collected, including forged birth certificates, fraudulent contracts, and even photographs of Damien secretly meeting with suspicious-looking men. There was also a detailed map showing the exact location of the mine property that belonged to the twins. Arthur heard a noise downstairs and immediately switched off the flashlight. Careful footsteps were coming up the wooden stairs, trying to be silent, but betraying the presence of at least 2 people. Quickly, he tucked the will inside his shirt and positioned himself behind the bedroom door. A familiar voice echoed down the hall. It was Damien, saying he knew Arthur was there and not to be foolish, just to give them what they wanted and no one would get hurt. Arthur responded, stepping out of hiding, asking what Damien wanted. He had already stolen his company, destroyed his life, and killed 2 innocent women. What more could he possibly want? Damien appeared at the bedroom door, accompanied by a large, intimidating man Arthur didn't recognize. His ex-partner looked more desperate than threatening, his red eyes and disheveled hair revealing days without proper sleep. He said he wanted Eleanor's true will, that he knew she had hidden something there, something that could destroy everything he had built. Arthur corrected him, saying everything he had stolen. Damien growled, taking a threatening step toward him, stating that those children were dangerous to a lot of people, that their inheritance was worth more money than he could imagine, and that very powerful people were interested in those mines. People who would not hesitate to eliminate any obstacle. Arthur asked if that included 2 4-year-old girls. Damien confirmed it included anyone who got in the way. It was in that moment that Arthur understood He had completely underestimated the situation. This wasn't just about Damien's personal greed. There was a larger network of people involved, probably other miners or businessmen who wanted to control the region where the twins' mines were located. Damien demanded to know where the girls were, his voice growing more threatening. Arthur replied that they were in a safe place, far from men like him. Damien's accomplice moved quickly, trying to grab Arthur, but he had anticipated the move. Using the bronze candlestick he still carried, Arthur struck the man on the head, causing him to stagger. He used the confusion to run towards the bedroom window. Damien yelled for him to stop, that he didn't understand, that they would never be safe. Even if he gave up, others would come. The only way to protect them was to hand over the documents and let him handle the situation the right way. Arthur stopped at the window, turning to face the man who had destroyed so many lives. He questioned what the right way was, like killing their father, like letting their mother die alone in the hospital, like stealing the inheritance that belonged to them. Damien exploded, shouting that Arthur knew nothing, that Isabella's husband was being blackmailed by criminal groups who wanted the mines, that he had eliminated him to protect the family, and when she fled, he tried to protect her too. Arthur called it a lie, that he had pursued them, terrorized them, manipulated them. Damien insisted it was because he knew others would do worse, that at least with him, they would have a chance to survive. Arthur studied Damien's face and saw something that surprised him, genuine fear. The man was terrified, not just of being discovered, but of something larger that threatened him as well. Arthur asked who these other people were. Damien revealed it was a mining cartel that controlled half the illegal operations in Colorado. And when they learned of the emerald mine's location through Isabella's husband, they decided they wanted it all. He was just an intermediary, someone to do the dirty work. And now they had lost patience. They had given him 1 week to deliver the twins or documents proving the legal transfer of the mine's ownership. If he failed, Damien didn't need to complete the sentence. Arthur understood that they were both in mortal danger, along with Lily and Rose. This was no longer a local dispute over property or family business. Much larger and more dangerous forces were involved. Arthur asked why he hadn't told him this before. Damien replied that he thought he could handle it alone, that he could protect them all without revealing the truth. But now it was too late for lies. Arthur looked out the window at the silent streets of Telluride. Somewhere in the town, 2 innocent girls were sleeping under the protection of an elderly doctor, unaware that they were the center of a conspiracy involving fortunes in precious stones and men willing to kill for money. He asked slowly that if he helped him, how could he be sure he wasn't being deceived again? Damien answered that now he had no choice. If they killed him, Arthur and the girls would be next. Their only chance was to work together to find a way out that protected the children and prevented those people from getting their hands on their inheritance. It was an impossible alliance between 2 men who had become enemies, united only by the desperate need to protect 2 innocent children from forces neither of them could face alone. The forced alliance between Arthur and Damien began at dawn, when they both returned to Dr. Desmond's house to explain the desperate situation they were all in. The retired doctor received Damien with visible suspicion, but the urgency of the situation allowed no luxury for personal grudges. Dr. Desmond asked if they were sure these people were as dangerous as they claimed, watching the twins who slept peacefully in the next room, oblivious to the whirlwind their lives had become. Damien replied, his voice heavy with a weariness that betrayed genuine fear, that he had seen these men eliminate entire families for much less. He asserted that they made no distinction between adults and children when it came to protecting their interests. Arthur studied his ex-partner's face, searching for signs of a lie, but found only exhaustion and desperation. He demanded to see the documents proving his claims. Damien opened a folder he was carrying and spread photographs, contracts, and correspondence across the kitchen table. The images showed intimidating-looking men in secret meetings, documents with forged signatures, and detailed maps of the region where the twins' emerald mines were located. He pointed to a middle-aged man in one of the photos, identifying him as Augustus Thorne, who controlled illegal mining operations in 4 states. It was he who had ordered the death of Isabella's husband when he discovered the young man would refuse to sell his family's land. Dr. Desmond examined the documents with professional attention, noting that the contracts seemed to have been prepared years ago, and asked how long they had been planning this. Damien protested that he wasn't planning anything, that he was recruited against his will after getting involved in some questionable transactions in Aspen, and when he tried to leave, they made it clear that wasn't an option. Arthur sarcastically asked if he was a victim too. Damien admitted he was a man who made wrong decisions and was now paying for them. But that didn't mean he wanted to see innocent children suffer for his mistakes. It was at that moment that Lily and Rose appeared in the kitchen, awakened by the urgent whispers of the adults. The twins observed the tension in the room and immediately positioned themselves near Arthur, their small hands seeking the security of his presence. Dr. Desmond murmured, asking what they would tell them. Rose made questioning gestures, clearly sensing that something important was being discussed. Arthur knelt to the girls' level and tried to explain through simple gestures that there were bad people looking for them, but that the adults were working to keep them safe. The twins' reaction was surprising. Instead of fear, they showed a resignation that revealed too much experience with danger for children their age. Lily made gestures that clearly asked if these bad people were the same ones who had hurt their mother. Arthur gently replied yes, but promised they wouldn't let them hurt them. It was then that Rose did something unexpected. She ran out of the house and returned a few minutes later, carrying a small cloth bag she had hidden in Dr. Desmond's garden. Inside the bag were objects none of the adults had seen before. Carefully folded documents, a small key, and a crude hand-drawn map. Arthur asked where this came from as he examined the papers. Lily made elaborate gestures, explaining that their mother had given these objects to them shortly before she died, instructing them to keep them hidden until they found someone they could completely trust. Dr. Desmond translated some of the more complex gestures, explaining that she was saying their mother knew dangerous men were coming and that these documents were proof that the mines legally belonged to the girls. Damien turned pale as he examined the papers. He recognized them as the original ownership documents for the mines and feared what would happen if Augustus discovered they had them. He warned that Thorne would kill all of them to ensure those documents never saw the light of day. The hand-drawn map showed not only the location of the emerald mines, but also secret routes to get there, and indications of where Isabella had hidden some of the precious stones she had managed to extract before the chase began. Dr. Desmond told the twins their mother was very smart, that she had left them with all the necessary tools to claim their inheritance when the time was right. But Damien interrupted, saying the right time might never come if they didn't resolve this situation soon. Augustus had given him a deadline of noon the next day. If he didn't show up with the girls or with legal transfer documents for the properties, he would come to Telluride personally. Arthur said they needed to find a third option, a way to protect the girls without handing their inheritance over to criminals. Dr. Desmond stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the silent streets of the historic town. He said slowly that there was one person who could help them, Judge Julian Silver, an old friend of his who worked at the court in Denver. He had experience with cases involving major criminals and witness protection. Damien protested that they didn't have time for legal processes, that these men didn't respect courts or laws. The doctor replied that perhaps not, but the judge had contacts with people who could face this kind of threat on equal terms. Arthur understood what Dr. Desmond was suggesting. He was talking about asking for help from other criminal groups. The doctor corrected him, saying he was talking about leveling the playing field. Augustus was powerful, but he wasn't the only influential man in Colorado. There were people who would be interested in preventing him from expanding his territory to Telluride. The suggestion created a moral dilemma for Arthur. Protect the twins using questionable methods, or try to resolve everything through legal means that might not be fast enough to keep them alive. Lily and Rose watched the discussion with wide, attentive eyes. Rose made gestures asking if they would have to run away again, if they would lose another family they had begun to love. Arthur firmly took the girl's small hands and said no, that they wouldn't run away and they wouldn't lose anyone else. It was a brave promise, considering he had no idea how to keep it. But looking at those two children who had faced so much suffering with dignity and courage, Arthur knew he would do whatever was necessary to protect them. He told Dr. Desmond to call his judge friend. He told Damien he would tell him everything, absolutely everything, about Augustus's operations and his men, and he would find a way to use the girls' own precious stones to buy their freedom. When Damien asked how, Arthur explained that if these mines were as valuable as they claimed, then they had something Augustus wanted more than revenge. They would offer him a partnership that was more profitable than simply stealing everything. It was a risky plan that depended on negotiating with dangerous criminals, but it was the only strategy Arthur could imagine that would protect the twins without putting them eternally on the run. That dawn, while the adults planned a negotiation that could save or condemn them all, Lily and Rose hugged each other on the living room sofa, their small forms creating an image of innocence amidst a world of dangers they barely understood, but which they would face with the silent courage that had become their trademark. The morning brought news that completely changed everyone's plans. Judge Julian Silver had returned Dr. Desmond's call with alarming information. Augustus Thorne and his men were already on their way to Telluride, having left Denver during the night. They had at most 6 hours before the historic town was invaded by professional criminals. Damien, clearly panicked, said they needed to leave immediately, that if they stayed, they would all die. Arthur asked where they would go, as Thorne had the resources to track them anywhere in Colorado. It was then that Dr. Desmond presented an unexpected alternative. There was a place they could go. His brother, Father Michael, ran an orphanage in a small town on the border with Utah, a place so remote it didn't even appear on most maps. Augustus would never think to look there. Damien questioned how an orphanage would protect them. The doctor explained with a mysterious smile that it wasn't an ordinary orphanage. Father Michael had spent the last 20 years offering refuge to threatened families, politicians, witnesses in important crimes, people who needed to disappear temporarily. He had experience with this type of situation. Arthur looked at the twins, who were sitting on the floor playing with small paper birds they had folded during the night. Their innocence amidst all the tension broke his heart. He wondered if the girls would understand why they needed to hide. Dr. Desmond replied that they already understood, observing how Lily and Rose occasionally glanced toward the window with an alert expression. He noted that these children had developed an impressive survival instinct. The preparation for departure was quick and silent. Each packed only the essentials, with Dr. Desmond preparing medications that might be needed during a prolonged stay at the orphanage. The twins, without needing detailed explanations, packed their few belongings in a small backpack, including the precious documents their mother had left. As they prepared to leave, Damien revealed disturbing details about Augustus's methods. He said that Thorne wasn't just coming for the girls. He had information that other criminal groups had also discovered the value of the mines. He was desperate because he knew that if he didn't act quickly, he would lose the opportunity. When Arthur asked about other groups, Damien mentioned rumors that an international cartel was interested in the region. If they arrived first, neither Augustus nor they would have a chance of survival. The situation was becoming more complex with each revelation. It was no longer just about protecting 2 children from a local criminal, but about keeping them all alive amidst a territorial war between powerful criminal organizations. As they were about to leave, Rose did something surprising. She ran to Dr. Desmond's garden and returned carrying a small makeshift cage containing 2 of the injured birds they had been caring for. With urgent gestures, she indicated that she couldn't leave them behind. Damien protested that they couldn't take birds on the run. Arthur interrupted, gently touching Rose's head, and said that if it made her feel safe, they would take them. The journey to the orphanage took 4 hours on secondary roads that wound through mountains covered in preserved forest. Dr. Desmond drove carefully, avoiding main roads where they could be easily tracked. The twins dozed for much of the trip, exhausted by the tension of the last few days. When they arrived at St. Francis Orphanage, Arthur was impressed by the simplicity and beauty of the place. It was a set of low, white-painted buildings, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens, where dozens of children played under the supervision of nuns and volunteers. Father Michael, Dr. Desmond's brother, was a tall, thin man of about 60, with white hair and eyes that radiated genuine kindness. He greeted them at the entrance with warm hugs, as if they were dear relatives arriving for a family visit. He led them to a private room and told them that his brother had explained the situation and that they would be safe there for as long as necessary. Arthur asked the priest if he was sure he could protect them, as they were talking about very dangerous criminals. The priest replied that in 20 years they had sheltered people fleeing from corrupt politicians, traffickers, and professional assassins, and that this place had a protection that went beyond what any bodyguard could offer. When asked what kind of protection, Father Michael smiled. The protection of the community. The entire population of the region knew the orphanage was sacred. Any threat to this place would be met by hundreds of people who grew up here or had their lives touched by their work. The twins were introduced to the other children at the orphanage and were immediately accepted into the group. It was touching to see how Lily and Rose, who had spent so much time isolated and suspicious, began to relax in the presence of other children who had also faced difficulties in their lives. One of the nuns, Sister Beatrice, who had worked with traumatized children her entire religious career, observed that they would be fine here, that there was something special in those 2, an inner strength that would help them heal. On that first night at the orphanage, while the twins slept in a cozy dormitory surrounded by other children, the adults met with Father Michael to discuss the next steps. Arthur said they couldn't stay hidden forever, that they would eventually need to find a permanent solution. The priest agreed, but noted that sometimes time is their best ally. Criminals like Augustus are impatient. If they don't get quick results, they often move on to other opportunities. Damien asked what would happen if he didn't give up. Then they would find another way to resolve the situation, the priest replied. But for now, they were safe, and that gave them time to think. During the second week at the orphanage, something unexpected happened. The twins began to make sounds, not words yet, but small noises indicating that their ability to speak was gradually returning. Dr. Desmond explained that the trauma that had caused their mutism was being healed by the safe and loving environment of the orphanage. Sister Beatrice called it a miracle during a conversation with Arthur, saying that in 20 years of working with traumatized children, she had rarely seen such a rapid recovery. Arthur replied, watching Lily and Rose play with other children in the garden, that maybe it was because they had finally found a place where they could just be children. It was during this conversation that news arrived that would change everything again. One of the orphanage volunteers, who had gone to the nearest town for supplies, returned with worrying information. Strange men had been seen asking questions about a group of adults traveling with twin girls. Damien paled, saying they had found them. Father Michael calmly replied that it wasn't necessarily so, that it could be just a random search, but they needed to be prepared. That night, Arthur made a decision he knew was risky, but which might be the only way to definitively protect the twins. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. Arthur's plan was audacious and dangerous. Instead of continuing to flee, he would go directly to the twins' emerald mines to recover the precious stones Isabella had hidden. With these riches, he could negotiate not only with Augustus, but also establish a permanent protection fund for Lily and Rose. Damien protested that it was madness, that Augustus would surely have men guarding the mine region, that it would be like walking straight into a trap. Arthur, studying the map drawn by the twins' mother, replied that, perhaps, but Thorn was looking for them here. He wouldn't expect them to return to where it all began. Father Michael watched the discussion with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many desperate decisions over the years. He told Arthur there was something he should know before making that decision, that he had received a very interesting call the previous night from Judge Julian. The judge had discovered something important about Augustus Thorn. The man wasn't just a criminal. He was being investigated by the federal government for tax evasion and money laundering. If they could get concrete proof of his criminal activities, they could turn him over to the proper authorities. Arthur felt a spark of hope and asked what kind of proof. Financial documents, records of illegal transactions, evidence of bribery, things that would be kept in his offices or personal properties, and where would they find that? According to the judge, Augustus kept detailed records of all his operations in a safe in the mine region itself. He was paranoid about his partners and documented everything as insurance in case he needed to defend himself or blackmail someone. Damien became visibly nervous at this revelation, warning them against trying to break into Thorn's offices. Arthur interrupted, asking if he knew the place. Damien confirmed he did, describing it as a fortified building on top of a hill, guarded 24 hours a day, impossible for ordinary people to breach. But not impossible for someone who knew the region intimately and had help from locals, Father Michael said with an enigmatic smile. The priest explained that many of the men working for Augustus were from the region and had family in the orphanage or nearby communities. Some were willing to help against their boss as long as their identities were protected and their families kept safe. Dr. Desmond asked if they were talking about an internal rebellion. Father Michael corrected him, saying they were talking about justice, that Augustus had terrorized these communities for years and it was time for him to answer for his actions. That afternoon, while the adults planned the risky operation, Lily and Rose did something that surprised everyone. They approached Arthur during dinner and for the first time since they had met, whispered audible words. Rose asked, her voice weak but clear, if Daddy was coming back. Arthur felt tears burning his eyes. It was the first time they had called him Daddy, and also the first time he heard their sweet, childish voices. He promised he would come back, that he would always come back for them. Lily whispered, her words broken but full of meaning, for him not to go away like Mommy did. Never like Mommy, Arthur promised. He said Daddy would come back, and they would be a real family forever. That night, Arthur spent hours sitting beside the twins' beds, watching them sleep, and reflecting on how his life had completely changed in a matter of weeks. He had spent 3 years in mourning and isolation, convinced he would never be happy again. Now, looking at those 2 children who had entered his life by saving him from a snake, he understood that true love sometimes arrived in the most unexpected ways. The expedition to the mines was organized for the following pre-dawn. Arthur, Damien, and 3 local men whom Father Michael had discreetly contacted would leave before sunrise. Doctor, Desmond would stay at the orphanage to protect the twins if something went wrong. The priest gave them final instructions, reminding them they had only one chance, that if Augustus discovered what they were doing, there would be no safe place to hide. The journey to the mine region took 4 hours along nearly impassable trails that wound through dense forest. The local men knew every stone of the path, guiding the group through shortcuts that allowed them to avoid the surveillance points Augustus had established on the main roads. When they arrived near the mines, Arthur was impressed by the operation Augustus had set up. Dozens of men worked in continuous shifts, extracting emeralds with modern equipment that contrasted with the natural beauty of the region. On top of a nearby hill, an imposing building served as the command center and residence for Augustus. Arthur whispered, watching the guards patrolling the perimeter, asking how they would get in. One of the local men, introduced only as John, replied that they wouldn't get in. They would make him come out. John explained that there was an alarm system connected to the mines themselves. If something interrupted production during the night, Augustus would personally come down to investigate, taking only a few trusted men with him and leaving the office protected only by electronic surveillance. Damien asked about the electronic surveillance. John smiled, saying his cousin worked on the system's maintenance, and at 2 in the morning there would be a technical failure lasting exactly 15 minutes. The plan was risky, but feasible. While John and his companions created a distraction at the mines, Arthur and Damien would have 15 minutes to break into the office, find the safe, and copy the documents they needed. At 2 in the morning sharp, controlled explosions echoed in the mine region, followed by shouts and alarms. As predicted, Augustus and his top men ran down the hill to investigate the supposed sabotage. Damien whispered, "Now!" and the 2 men ran toward the abandoned office. The building's interior was luxurious, contrasting with the rustic environment of the region. Expensive furniture, works of art, and a huge safe dominated the main office. Damien, knowing Augustus's paranoia, went directly to a specific wall where he knew the safe was hidden. He murmured about the combination, trying different numerical sequences based on important dates, before exclaiming in success. The safe opened, revealing hundreds of documents, flash drives, and compromising photographs. Arthur began to quickly photograph everything that seemed important, while Damien copied files from the electronic devices. It was then that they found something that completely changed their perspective on the whole situation. An entire folder dedicated to the twins, containing not only information about the mines, but also photographs of them since they were babies, detailed medical records, and a document that revealed the most shocking truth of all. Lily and Rose were not just heirs to emerald mines. They were the last direct descendants of one of the founding families of Telluride, with legal rights to properties that were worth far more than any deposit of precious stones. The discovery of the twins' true heritage left Arthur stunned as he continued to photograph documents in Augustus's safe. The girls were not just orphans who had inherited emerald mines, they were direct descendants of the minuscule Telluride family, one of the oldest and most influential lineages in the region, with legal rights to urban properties, historic farms, and even stakes in century-old companies. Damien whispered that this was why Augustus was so desperate as he copied the last files. It wasn't just about precious stones. If the girls claimed their full inheritance, they could destabilize the entire corruption scheme he had built in the region. Arthur asked how many minutes they had left, his hands trembling as he photographed documents proving decades of fraud, bribery, and intimidation. 3 minutes, Damien replied. They had to go. Arthur took the most important original documents and tucked them into his shirt, deciding that some physical evidence would be necessary in addition to the photographs. It was risky, as Augustus would immediately realize he had been robbed. But without concrete evidence, it would be difficult to convince the authorities. When they left the office, the emergency lights were already coming back on, signaling that the distraction at the mines was over. They ran through the dense forest, guided by the local men who knew every trail and hiding spot in the region. John warned them during the escape that Augustus would find out he'd been robbed before dawn and would be furious, and that they needed to leave the region immediately. The return to the orphanage was a race against time. They knew Augustus would mobilize all available resources to find those responsible for the theft, and the safe place where they had left the twins would become a top target. They arrived at the orphanage as the sun began to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in golden hues that contrasted with the urgency of the situation. Father Michael was waiting for them with worrying news. He reported that armed men had been seen in the nearest town during the night, asking aggressive questions about them and threatening local merchants. Arthur immediately asked where the girls were. They were safe in the orphanage's basement, with Sister Beatrice caring for them, but they couldn't keep them hidden for long as the other children would start asking questions. Dr. Desmond examined the documents Arthur had brought. His eyes widening with each revelation, he declared it was enough evidence to bring down not just Augustus, but an entire network of corruption that included politicians, judges, and businessmen. The problem, Damien said nervously, was that now all these powerful people would be hunting them too. It was no longer just about protecting the girls from Augustus. It was at this moment that Father Michael revealed a plan he had been developing overnight. He said there was a way to resolve this definitively, but it would require courage and a dose of faith. When Arthur asked what he had in mind, the priest explained his plan to release everything to the national press simultaneously with the federal authorities, making the story so public that it would be impossible for any of these criminals to act without complete exposure. The priest explained that he had contacts with investigative journalists in New York and Washington, D.C., people who specialized in exposing corruption cases in remote regions. If the twins' story became national, with media coverage and public pressure, not even Augustus would dare to attack directly. Dr. Desmond asked about the girls' safety during this period. Father Michael replied with an enigmatic smile that they had an even safer hiding place, an isolated monastery in the mountains, run by an order of monks experienced in protecting threatened people. They could stay there until the whole situation was resolved. Arthur went down to the basement to explain the situation to the twins, finding them playing quietly with cloth dolls that Sister Beatrice had made during the night. Lily and Rose ran to hug him as soon as they saw him, their small voices whispering words of relief. Rose said that Daddy was back, her vocabulary expanding rapidly as she felt safer. Arthur confirmed he always comes back, kneeling to be at their level. He explained that now they needed to take one more trip to an even safer place. Lily, with her impressive intuition for a 4-year-old, asked if the bad men were still looking for them. Yes, he confirmed, but not for much longer. He told them that Daddy had found a way to make them stop forever. The twins accepted the need for another move with the resignation they had developed. But this time, something was different. They trusted Arthur completely, knowing he wouldn't abandon them as so many adults had before. The journey to the monastery took the entire day on roads even more remote than the previous ones. The place was truly isolated, nestled between mountain peaks covered by low clouds that created an almost mystical atmosphere. The monks who ran the place were men of few words but decisive actions. They settled the twins in simple but cozy rooms with internal gardens where they could play without being seen from the outside. The abbot, an elderly man with kind eyes, explained that this place had existed for over 200 years, having sheltered fugitive kings, revolutionaries, and entire families escaping persecution. The mountains were their protection and discretion was their tradition. That night, while the twins slept peacefully in the monastery rooms, Arthur made the calls that would change everything. Father Michael had arranged a conference call with journalists from 3 major media outlets, Judge Julian and representatives of the FBI. For 2 hours, Arthur recounted the entire story, from the rattlesnake rescue to the discovery of the twins' true identity. He sent photographs of the documents via encrypted email, provided precise locations of Augustus's criminal operations, and revealed the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. The journalist from the capital said that this case would shake the power structures of the entire region, that they were talking about a corruption network that spanned decades and involved some of the most influential families in Colorado. Arthur asked when the story would be published. Simultaneously, in all outlets, the next morning she replied, and the FBI was already mobilizing teams for coordinated operations throughout the region. It was the culmination of weeks of suffering, fear, and uncertainty. In less than 24 hours, the whole truth would be publicly exposed, and the men who had terrorized so many families would finally face the consequences of their actions. But Arthur knew that the real victory was not in Augustus's defeat or the recovery of the twins' inheritance. The real victory was in the simple rooms of the monastery, where 2 brave girls finally slept in peace, knowing they had a family that loved them unconditionally. The next morning, as the first news stories began to circulate in newspapers across the country, Lily and Rose would wake up no longer as fugitive orphans, but as heiresses protected by the full force of the law and public opinion. More importantly, they would wake up as the beloved daughters of a man who had discovered that true love sometimes arrived in the most unexpected forms. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you so much.